Hello and welcome to Sansad Television. I am Akhilesh, Suman, and you are watching a special report on the takeaways for India from the G20 summit that concluded in Indonesian city of Bali in November.
The G20 summit was held on 15th and 16th November 2022 in Bali, one of the major tourist destinations and scenic spots of the world. The host and chair of the summit was Indonesian President Joko Widodo.
मैं एक बार फिर अपने मित्र राष्ट्रपति जोकोविच का अभिनंदन करना चाहता हूं। उन्होंने इस कठिन समय में G20 को कुशल नेतृत्व दिया है।
The city of Bali was suitably decked up for the occasion, with all the arrangements in place to ensure comfort and convenience of the high-profile guests.
Official welcome by His Excellency the President of Indonesia. We have been working very closely with Indonesia to support their presidency, and we have also worked with Indonesia to give a larger voice to the global south in the G20.
This was the second time since 2018 that the G20 summit was taking place in a developing country, when Argentina had hosted it. The summit was also taking place at a time when the world is facing an acute food and energy crisis due to the Russia-Ukraine war.
जियोपॉलिटिकल तनावों, आर्थिक मंदी, खाद्यान्न और ऊर्जा की बढ़ी हुई कीमतों और महामारी के दीर्घकालीन दुष्प्रभावों से एक साथ जूझ रहा है। ऐसे समय विश्व G20 की तरफ आशा की नजर से देखता है।
No wonder these two issues came up for heated discussions in the very first session of the summit on 15th November. Intervening in the discussion, Prime Minister Narendra Modi categorically mentioned that the supply chains of the world are in shambles. He pointed out that this was especially problematic for the poorer countries that had no financial capacity to handle the situation. Prime Minister Modi's statement was virtually a mirror to the global community that had seen devastation by the 2-year-long COVID-19 pandemic.
During the session on food and energy security, the text of this has already been shared. You would have seen in Prime Minister's intervention the emphasis on the impact of contemporary developments on the developing world. He particularly underlined the criticality of resilient supply chains for food, fertilizer and energy, and the need for affordable finance for smooth energy transition for the global south. Prime Minister Modi also highlighted India's effort.
No wonder then that the Bali Declaration recognized in full the distortions in the world food market. The declaration set down what India had said and practiced all along, both during and after the pandemic period, in helping the poor and the developing countries. The G20 declaration said member nations will avoid adversely impacting food security deliberately. They also commit to facilitate humanitarian supplies for ensuring access to food in emergency situations.
To further food security for our own citizens, as also for the needs of other developing countries, and in this context shared India's own achievements and experiences, including the practices of natural farming, and called upon the G20 members to celebrate the International Year of Millets 2023. Prime Minister later attended the second session on the health.
Prime Minister Modi drew the attention of the G20 members to the sanctions regime that has had a crippling effect mainly on the developing countries. He said no restriction should be imposed on the supply of energy. Asserting that India is the world's fastest growing economy, the Prime Minister said G20 leaders must ensure stability in the energy markets of the world.
For international economic cooperation and underlined the importance of G20 continuing to demonstrate its capacity to bring together major economies to overcome the global challenges.
Earlier, opening the floor for discussion, Indonesian President urged all member countries to abide by the rule of law and the UN Charter. In stating this, he was echoing what India had been saying since the beginning of Russia-Ukraine war. Widodo reiterated the need for a ceasefire and the return to diplomacy. The final declaration at the summit echoed Prime Minister Modi's counsel to the Russian President Putin a few months ago that this is not an era of war. The declaration reiterated today's era must not be of war.
Being responsible means respecting international laws and principles of the UN Charter consistently. Being responsible means creating win-win, not zero-sum situations. Being responsible here also means that we must end the war. If the war does not end, it will be difficult for the world to move forward.
The G20 summit debated these issues long and hard. Divergent views came up on the Ukraine war. India urged the parties concerned to bring the talks initiative center stage instead of violence. The Bali Declaration stated that there was a need for ceasefire, even though not everyone condemned the Russian military operation in Ukraine.
The second session of the summit was dedicated to health. All members at the summit recognized that in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, every country is facing the brunt of healthcare unpreparedness. They also felt that health facilities continue to be uneven even after the pandemic. The Indonesian president expressed his frustration at the uneven health facilities, urging rich countries to invest in the health sector of developing countries. He also urged a relaxation in the TRIPS waiver for developing countries. The waiver will help nations like India to acquire new technology for health facilities and infrastructure. Prime Minister Modi's call of One World, One Health was also reflected in the final draft. The draft underscored the implementation of the One Health approach. The G20 members also deliberated climate change issues. There was consensus that the developed countries need to honor their commitments. Members also sought transparency in fulfilling the commitments by different countries in containing carbon emissions. In the words of the declaration, members affirmed that they support continued deliberations on an ambitious new collective quantified goal of climate finance from a floor of $100 billion per year to support developing countries that helps in fulfilling the objective of the UNFCCC.
प्राकृतिक संसाधनों पर ओनरशिप का भाव आज संघर्ष को जन्म दे रहा है और पर्यावरण की दुर्दशा का मुख्य कारण बना है। प्लेनेट के सुरक्षित भविष्य के लिए ट्रस्टीशिप का भाव ही समाधान है। इसमें लाइफ यानी लाइफस्टाइल फॉर एनवायरनमेंट अभियान एक बड़ा योगदान दे सकता है। इसका उद्देश्य सस्टेनेबल लाइफस्टाइल को एक जन आंदोलन बनाना है।
The second day of the summit was devoted to the session on digital transformation. Prime Minister Modi showcased India's progress in the field of digital transactions. India's success in UPI transactions has been unique in that it has served not only the poorest of the poor, but the rich as well in equal measure, providing consumer comfort as well as helping SMEs. The G20 declaration supported and declared its own financial inclusion framework in harnessing digitization on the lines adopted by India.
This is an area where India is a global leader, and Prime Minister used this opportunity to highlight actions taken by India and offered to share our expertise in this space. Prime Minister Modi highlighted the importance of technology and an open, inclusive and empowering public digital infrastructure in fostering global economic transformation, building inclusive societies, empowering billions of people and improving livelihoods. Digital transformation will also feature among the key priorities during India's G20 presidency that commences on 1st of December.
In the closing session, Prime Minister Modi received the presidency of G20 for the next 1 year. This will be effective from 1st of December 2022 and will last till 30th November 2023. Accepting the presidency, Prime Minister Modi said the Indian presidency will be action-oriented. India will have 200 meetings of G20-related activities across the country. The exercise will boost internal infrastructure and facilities in the nation.
आज मैं ये आश्वासन देना चाहता हूं कि भारत की G20 अध्यक्षता इंक्लूसिव, एम्बिशियस, डिसिसिव और एक्शन ओरिएंटेड होगी। एक्सेलेंसी, अगले 1 साल में हमारा प्रयत्न रहेगा कि G20 नए विचारों की परिकल्पना के लिए और सामूहिक एक्शन को गति देने के लिए एक ग्लोबल प्राइम मूवर की तरह काम करे।
Prime Minister Modi was given the baton of the G20 presidency by Indonesian President. Widodo said as part of the Troika, Indonesia will support India with its experiences in holding the presidency as the former president of the grouping. Prime Minister Modi also assured G20 members that India's presidency will work towards mainstreaming developing countries on the world economic map.
भारत अपनी G20 अध्यक्षता के दौरान इंडोनेशिया के सराहनीय इनिशिएटिव को आगे बढ़ाने का भरसक प्रयत्न करेगा। आज आवश्यकता है कि विकास के लाभ सर्वस्पर्शी और सर्वसमावेशी हो। हमें विकास के लाभों को ममभाव और समभाव से मानव मात्र तक पहुंचाना होगा।
G20 adopted the leaders' declaration that asked for the immediate withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine. However, it recognized differences on the interpretation and the assessments of the situation and the sanctions regime. The leaders concluded that security issues could have significant consequences for the global economy. Again, it was India that prevailed on Russia to accept the declaration and let it be adopted by consensus.
Even White House in Washington, D.C. recognized the contributions of India in negotiations. As a matter of fact, it was India who could enjoy proximity with all the parties concerned, and India contributed in successful consensus statement at the end of G20 summit.
Also big on the mind of the leaders were the problems of jobless growth. The G20 declaration advocated coordinated action to advance an agenda for a strong, inclusive and resilient global recovery and sustainable development that delivers jobs and growth. Member nations decided to make public investments in sectors that will improve job situations. They also resolved to promote private investments and strengthen multilateral trade and resilience of global supply chains to support long-term growth. Further, they recommended efforts by individual central banks to achieve price stability.
G20 members suggested that countries across the world strengthen dialogue between producers and consumers. This is aimed at reducing the communication gap between groups that often create political instability and chaos in some countries.
Trade was another subject that came up for intense debate among the G20 members. The members recognized that 1 or 2 countries alone cannot bear the burden of supplies around the world. Advocating the need for decentralization in the global supply chain, member countries urged the creation of level playing fields to ensure fair competition. India is expected to benefit from this in enhancing its trade as well as manufacturing capacities. The G20 declaration decided to continue with focused consultation on issues related to reforms in WTO that is for most part tilted towards Western nations.
The Indonesian presidency had taken initiative to hold discussions on policy coherence between trade, investment and industry. Now, as the president of G20, it will be India's turn to take it forward and pursue member nations to provide a level playing field in industrial sectors too.
Prime Minister Modi was one of the major figures of the G20 summit. With India being the biggest democracy as well as the biggest open market, PM Modi occupied the lead chair as member of the Troika along with the Indonesian president. The Prime Minister spent 45 hours in Bali along with External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar and National Security Advisor Ajit Doval, holding bilateral meetings and interactions with counterparts. One of the major meetings of the Prime Minister Modi was with US President Joe Biden. The informal tone of interactions underlined the chemistry between the heads of governments of the oldest and biggest democracies.
Prime Minister reviewed the continuing deepening of the India-US strategic partnership and expressed satisfaction about the ongoing strong cooperation between the two countries in groupings such as the Quad, ITU2, etc. Prime Minister Modi and President Biden agreed to maintain close cooperation during India's G20 presidency.
Another highlight of Prime Minister Modi's bilateral meetings was his talks with newly elected Prime Minister of United Kingdom, Rishi Sunak. This was the first interaction of Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister with PM Modi. According to the officials of the Ministry of External Affairs, both leaders discussed issues related to trade, economy and defence. Prime Minister Modi apprised the British Prime Minister of opportunities for private investment in India's defence manufacturing. In other meetings, Modi met French President, Italy's newly elected Prime Minister, Australian Prime Minister, German Chancellor, Spanish Prime Minister, Singapore Prime Minister and Indonesian President. A striking visual from the summit was Prime Minister Modi shaking hands with Chinese President Xi Jinping when they encountered each other at the dinner.
You know, between nations, especially those which are neighbors, you have very high level of contestation, very high level of even conflict. But you know, you have to keep open the doors of diplomacy and the doors of talking to each other. And the Prime Minister did well to walk up to Xi Jinping, greet him. Let's see how things work out. The President of China also needs to realize that India is not just a neighbor. India is an important, big and a significant neighbor, and good neighborly relations would do China as much good as it would do India.
More than the formal discussions, multilateral fora like G20 summit provide a space for leaders to meet and exchange their views in a more personalized setting. Such interactions allow leaders to develop personal chemistry with their counterparts.
Prime Minister Modi's visit along with other G20 members to Indonesia's mangrove was a reiteration of the importance that India gives to issues relating to green cover and maritime protection. The Prime Minister also planted a sapling that will age in step with the grouping.
In all, the Bali Declaration had 52 recommendations that will further understanding among countries that matter. India is all set for the world stage, spearheading global responsibility that will enhance its credibility among the Committee of Nations as the President of G20. And that's all in this report. Thank you for watching.